The Duke married her at dawn, and by midnight he had sent her up the servants' stair to sleep among the maids. On the strength of a single sealed letter he had not even watched her break. Serafina did not cry out, and she did not beg. She only picked up her one small locked diary from the cold step where the footman had set it, held it against her ribs the way a person holds the last warm thing in a freezing room, and began to climb into the dark. And the reason that staircase would one day empty an entire estate behind her is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She was 23 years old. She had been a duchess for 19 hours. The great hall of Ravenmoor was lit by 400 candles that night, and every one of them seemed to lean toward her as she stood at the foot of the grand staircase in her wedding gown, a deep crimson silk cut off the shoulder, sewn with antique gold roses that some poor woman in the village had ruined her eyes to embroider. There was a black velvet sash at her waist, and a thin gold chain at her throat, and small teardrop earrings of pearl and gold that had been her mother's, and she wore all of it like armor, because that morning in the cold chapel she had believed, for one foolish hour, that she had been saved. The man at the top of the stairs did not look saved, he looked carved. Alaric, Duke of Ravenmoor, stood on the landing with the letter open in his hand, and the candlelight caught the faint old scar through his left eyebrow and the hard line of his jaw and made him look less like a husband than a judge. He was 6'2" and broad through the shoulders, and he wore black velvet with antique gold braid, and on his smallest finger there was a heavy gold signet ring that he turned, once, the way another man might cock a pistol. His eyes were the gray of a storm that has not yet decided where to break. "You are not who you said you were," he said. His voice did not rise. That was the terrible thing. It did not rise at all. Serafina opened her mouth. The whole hall was listening. The housekeeper, the footman, the long silent line of servants brought down to witness whatever this was to be, and she felt the listening like a weight on her chest. "I am exactly who I said I was," she answered. He came down 3 steps and stopped, as though 3 steps were as close as he could bear to be. "This letter," he said, "says otherwise. It says you came into this house to empty it. It says the woman I married this morning is a fortune hunter and a liar, and that everything you told me about who you are and where you came from was invented to put your hand on my name." He let the paper fall open so the seal showed, a seal she did not recognize. "It is in a hand I know. It names things only family could know. So I will ask you once, and you will tell me the truth in front of these people. Did you come here to rob me? And here is the cruelty of it. The cruelty that would take 5 years to undo." She could not say where she had truly come from. She had been forbidden it her whole life, sworn to silence by the only people who had ever protected her, on a danger she did not fully understand. And so the one answer that might have saved her was the one answer she had promised, on her mother's grave, never to speak aloud. She had walked into that marriage believing it would finally make her safe enough to tell him. Instead, he was demanding the secret at the top of a staircase, in front of 40 strangers, with a forgery in his fist. "No," she said, "only that." "I did not," then explained the letter. "I cannot." Something moved behind his eyes and was crushed before it could become anything. "Then you will not sleep in my wife's chambers tonight," he said, "or any night until you can, Bess." A gray-haired woman near the wall flinched. "Take her up the back stair. Put her in the wing with the maids. She is mistress of nothing in this house until she tells me the truth." A younger man might have shouted it. He read it out flat and final, a sentence off a page, and that was how Serafina understood. Standing there in her crimson and gold, that he believed it completely, that somewhere between the chapel and the candles, someone had reached into this man and turned him to stone, and that the someone had used her name to do it. She did not faint, and she did not weep, and she did not give the watching household the satisfaction of a single sound. She looked up the length of the staircase at the husband of 19 hours, and she let him see that she had heard him, and that she was not broken, and that she would remember. Then a footman set her small locked diary down on the bottom step, as if it were the only thing in her trousseau worth returning, and Serafina bent and took it up and held it to her chest, and turned, and followed the trembling old woman through a narrow door beside the great fireplace that she had not even known was there. The door shut behind her, and the noise of the hall vanished as if it had been a dream, and there was only a cold whitewashed stairwell, one guttering tallow candle in an iron bracket, and the smell of damp stone and cooling tallow. The gray-haired woman went up ahead of her with the candle, and her shoulders shook, and at the first turning she stopped and pressed the back of her chapped hand to her mouth. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I don't. There's been a wickedness done tonight. I've served this house 30 years, and I've never. That man up there is not himself. I'd take my life on it. He came back from the city 3 weeks ago, another creature entirely." "What is your name?" Seraphina asked. "Bess, Your Grace, lady's maid." "Was then Bess," she said, and her voice was steady, steadier than the candle. "You will not call me Your Grace where they can hear you. You will call me what they call the maids, and you will tell no one that I did not cry." She had eaten worse meals than the one waiting in the attic room that night. She had slept in worse beds than the narrow iron cot with the thin gray blanket. There was a chipped basin, a stub of candle, a single dormer window the size of a Bible, and a draft that came through the gap under the door and crossed the bare boards like a living thing, and found her ankles no matter where she stood. But she had been a child who learned early that a roof is a roof, and she did not waste the night grieving the bed. She waited until the house had gone silent. Then she knelt on the cold floor in her ruined wedding gown, and she went along the base of the wall with her fingertips, the way she had been taught to find the loose stone in any room she was ever made to sleep in, because a person with a secret must always have somewhere to put it. The fourth brick from the corner moved. She worked it free, and behind it was a black cavity the size of 2 fists, dry, forgotten hers. She wrapped the little diary in a square of linen torn from her own hem, and she set it inside, and she pushed the brick back flush, and she pressed her palm flat against it in the dark. Inside that diary, under a tarnished brass lock for which only she had the key, were 2 things the Duke of Ravenmore would have given the whole of his estate to have read that night, and would in 5 years nearly lose the whole of it because he had not. But that is to get ahead of the story. If you have ever watched the world decide a good person was worthless and quietly, fiercely wanted to be there on the day the world was proven wrong. If some part of you still believes that the one the whole room dismisses is the one worth choosing, the overlooked one, the cast-off one, the one made to take the back stair in her own house, then you already belong here, and you should take one moment now to subscribe, because that is the only kind of love story this channel tells, and Seraphina's is not going to end where you think it will. Stay with her. The night she finally comes back down those stairs is the night the whole estate turns to follow. In the morning, before the bells, she put off the crimson gown forever. There was no other dress in the attic but a coarse one of dove-gray wool that Bess brought up red-eyed and, folded over her arm, with a white linen collar and a frayed white apron, the uniform of the lowest housemaid in the wing. Seraphina put it on without a word. She kept the thin gold chain, but she wore it beneath the collar where no one would see it, against her skin, the one piece of the Duchess she would not surrender. She pinned her auburn hair back plain. She looked at herself in the warped little glass over the basin and saw a servant, and she understood that this was now the shape of her life, for a day or a year or however long it took the man downstairs to learn what he had done. And she decided, looking at that gray reflection, that she would not spend the time hating him. Hatred was a fire, and fires went out, and she needed something that would last. She chose patience instead. Patience was a stone. Stone kept. The household did not know what to make of her. By the second week there was a name for her below stairs, and it had come down from above, from the bright drawing rooms, carried on the tongues of the visiting ladies. Lady Margaret Fenwick was the one who coined it. A hard, powdered woman of 50 with steel-gray ringlets and a jeweled turban and a painted fan she used like a blade, who had never in her life let a cruelty go unsaid when an audience was near. She had heard the whole delicious tale, that the new Duke of Ravenmore had married a nobody and put her in the attic the same night, and she rolled it on her tongue at the supper table, where the servants could hear, and she gave Seraphina the name that would follow her for 5 years. "The attic Duchess," she said, and snapped her fan, and the table laughed, and a footman carried the laughter down to the kitchens like a dish. The attic Duchess. It should have been the thing that finally bent her. Instead, Seraphina took it the way she took everything that season, quietly without a word, folding it away inside her where it could not be used against her. She had learned long ago that a person who never reacts gives an enemy nothing to push against. So she did not weep at the name, and she did not flush at it. And within a month the kitchen maids who had laughed the loudest were the ones who fell silent when Lady Fenwick said it, because there was something in the gray-clad woman's stillness that made the joke feel less like a joke and more like a thing they would one day be ashamed of. It was not that she was meek. Bess knew she was not meek the night the new scullery girl was beaten by the cook for breaking a dish she had not broken. It was the attic Duchess who stepped between them in the steam and the noise, and said 3 quiet words that stopped the cook's hand in the air, and no one ever quite remembered afterward what the 3 words had been. Only that the cook had gone pale and put the ladle down. It was not meekness. It was something the house had no word for yet. She was given the mending. That was Lady Coraline Vane's particular touch, and Seraphina understood it as such the moment the basket appeared. Coraline Vane had arrived at Ravenmoor a fortnight before the wedding as a distant cousin of the late Duchess, and she had never left, and now she moved through the great rooms as though they had been built around her. She was 31 and beautiful in the cold, finished way of a woman who has decided exactly what her face is worth, with sleek raven hair dressed high and jeweled, sharp dark eyes, thin red lips, and a single emerald green gown after another, each one sewn with silver, a diamond choker always at her throat. She sat in the late Duchess's chair by the fire in the drawing-room, and she rang for things, and the Duke, who spoke to no one, spoke to her. And it was Coraline who sent down word that since the attic Duchess was so very fond of fine things, she might be trusted with the mending of the household's finest things, and chief among them the Duke's own coats. So every night, after the long day's work in the wing, Seraphina sat at the scrubbed kitchen table by a single candle and mended the clothes of the man who had banished her, his shirts, his cravats, the black velvet tailcoats with their antique gold braid. She turned his frayed cuffs and set his loose buttons and drew the torn seams of his sleeves, closed with stitches so small and even that the laundry maids brought their own worst work to her in secret to be fixed, because no one in the house sewed like the attic Duchess. She held his coats in her lap in the candlelight, the warm weight of them, the faint scent of him in the wool, and she felt the whole strange cruelty of it, that she should be the one, of all the women under that roof, to keep him whole at the seams. And she did not let herself weep over it, not once, though her eyes stung some nights from more than the close work and the low light. There was a boy who watched her sew. His name was Tom, though everyone called him Little Tom, and he was the kitchen boy, 10 years old or near it, barefoot in a rough smock 3 sizes too large, with a smudged face and quick dark eyes that missed nothing in that house. He had no mother that anyone knew of and slept by the kitchen hearth. And from the first night he had attached himself to the gray-clad lady who did not shout and did not slap, and once, when no one was looking, had pressed half her own supper bread into his hand. He brought her thread, he brought her the stubs of candles he found. And little Tom, who ran messages all over the great house and passed through its grand rooms unseen, as only a poor child is ever truly unseen, brought her something else too over those 5 years, scrap by scrap. He brought her what he heard. It was little Tom who first told her, in a whisper by the banked fire, that the sealed letter had come up from the city in Lady Vane's own traveling case. Seraphina's needle stopped, only for a breath, then it went on. "You're certain," she said, very low. The boy nodded hard. "Saw it, didn't I? Helped carry her cases up from the coach the day she come. One of 'em had a writing box in it and papers and wax, and one o' them little brass seals on a chain. And the night before the wedding I seen her light still burning when all the rest was dark, and her at the writing box. I didn't think nothing of it." He scuffed his bare heel against the flagstone, ashamed. "Then they sent you up here, and I thought of the seal." A seal she did not recognize, the Duke had said, holding the forged letter to the candlelight. "In a hand, I know. It names things only family could know." Seraphina sat very still over the half-mended sleeve, and the patience she had chosen on her first gray morning settled deeper into her, down into the bone, because now she understood at least the shape of the thing that had been done to her. Someone had needed her gone, and had been clever, and had been close. She did not yet have the proof. A frightened boy's memory of a candle and a brass seal would not unmake a forgery in any court, and certainly not in the cold court of the man upstairs. But she had a thread now, and Seraphina had spent her whole life learning that a person who is patient with a single thread can, in time, pull a whole wall down. If you have come this far into Seraphina's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She wrote it all in the diary that night. The seal, the writing box, the boy's burning candle in the dark, By the light of a stub no longer than her thumb, behind the loose brick, under the brass lock, she set it down in her small, even hand, the way she set down everything in those years, every cruelty, every kindness, every scrap little Tom carried up to her, because she had decided that if she could keep nothing else of herself, she would keep the truth, and the truth would keep. The seasons turned over the great house, and Seraphina did not leave the wing. Twice a year there were balls. The Duke gave them because a Duke must, great glittering nights, when every carriage in the county rolled up the long drive and the 400 candles were lit again and the hall she had been banished from filled with silk and music. On those nights the attic Duchess was sent in with the lowest servants to carry trays, and she carried them, gray and silent at the cold edge of the warm light, while women in jewels danced where she had once stood in crimson and gold. Lady Fenwick made certain to find her on those nights, to remark in a carrying voice on how well the attic Duchess bore a tray, and the visiting ladies tittered behind their fans. Coraline Vane never looked at her at all. That was worse, and Seraphina understood that it was meant to be. She watched the Duke on those nights because she could not help it. He did not dance. He stood at the head of the room in his black and gold with a glass he did not drink, and he received the bowing guests with the same carved stillness he had turned on her at the foot of the stairs. And Seraphina, passing among the dancers with her tray, saw what perhaps no one else in that bright crowd troubled to see, that the man was not cold because he felt nothing, but cold because he was holding something down with all his strength, and that it was costing him. Twice across 5 years their eyes met over the heads of the dancers, the Duchess in gray and the Duke in gold, and twice he was the one who looked away first, and Seraphina carried her tray on into the candlelight and told herself it meant nothing, and did not believe herself. There was a winter in the 3rd year when a fever went through the wing, and it was the attic Duchess, not the doctor from the town, who carried the house through it. She had been raised, in the years she did not speak of, by a woman with an apothecary's hands, and she had learned at that woman's side how to break a fever with steam and bitter root and patience, how to read the turning point of a sickness in a person's breathing in the dark. So when 3 of the laundry maids took to their cot burning, and the doctor came once and shrugged and named a high price and did not come again, Seraphina sat up with them night after night in the cold attic, and she sponged them and dosed them and breathed with them through the worst hours, and she did not lose one. The household noticed. Servants talk, and what they said that winter was that the gray woman in the wing had hands that knew more than mending, and that for all the great folk downstairs called her nothing, there was not a soul below stairs who would not have walked through fire for her by the spring. She kept the stable too in her quiet way. Out in the cobbled yard there was a black stallion named Tempest, a magnificent vicious creature the late Duke had bred and no living groom could hold. He had thrown 3 men and broken a 4th's arm and bitten clean through a stall door, and the grooms had taken to drugging his feed on the nights the Duke meant to ride. But on the nights Seraphina could not sleep, she went out across the wet cobbles in her gray wool and stood at the rail of his stall and said nothing at all, only breathed, slow and even, until the great black head came down over the rail and the steaming nostrils found her hair, and the horse that no man could hold went still under one steady palm. The grooms watched it through the tack-room window the first time and crossed themselves. After that they simply sent for her. There was a thing in the cast-off Duchess that the animals and the children and the old servants all read long before the grand folk in the bright rooms ever troubled to look, a steadiness, a kept and quiet weight, the very thing a frightened man at the top of a staircase had once mistaken for a lie. The thread little Tom had given her did not stay a single thread for long. It was old Mr. Hartwell who gave her the second. The steward of Ravenmore was 60 years old, with neat silver hair and spectacles, and a long, sober face, and a worn black coat with a brass chain of office. And he had served the Duke's father before him and loved this house with the settled, proprietary love of a man who has spent his whole life keeping it in order. For 5 years he had watched the wrongness in it and said nothing, because a steward does not question a duke, but his conscience had worn at him like water at a step. And one autumn evening in the 4th year he came down to the wing on the pretext of the household accounts, and he found the attic Duchess at her mending, and he stood a long moment turning his hat in his hands. "There is a thing I have never told anyone," he said at last very quietly, "about the night you came. I have asked myself 100 times whether I should carry it to my grave. I find I cannot." Seraphina set down her needle and folded her hands and waited, the way she had learned to wait. "The letter that was read against you," Hartwell said. "His Grace did not find it himself. It was brought to him by Lady Vane. She told him she had discovered it among the late Duchess's papers, that it had been sent in confidence by a relation of yours who could not bear to see the family deceived." His old hands tightened on the hat brim. "I was in the room. I saw her give it to him. And I have served this family 40 years, Your Grace, and I tell you, the late Duchess kept her papers in a locked cabinet to which only I held the second key, and there was no such letter in it. I would stake my soul there was not. I have lain awake on it 4 years." He looked up, and his eyes behind the spectacles were wet. "I did not speak because I had no proof, and she had the Duke's whole confidence, and I am an old man with nothing but my place. God forgive me. I have let a wickedness stand." "You are speaking now," Seraphina said gently. "That is not nothing, Mr. Hartwell." "It is very nearly nothing," the old man said, "without the letter itself to set beside a true one in her hand, and that she will have burned long ago." But she had not burned it. That was the one thing none of them yet knew. Coraline Vane had been too clever to burn it and too vain to part with it. For the forged letter was the proof of her own cleverness. The masterwork that had won her the run of a dukedom and a certain kind of person cannot destroy the evidence of their own genius any more than a porter can burn their best canvas. She had kept it. She had kept it locked in the very writing box little Tom had seen carried up the stairs, in the green sitting room that had once been the late Duchess's, the room Coraline now called her own. It took Seraphina the better part of a year to be certain of that, patient thread by patient thread, and another season to find her chance. The chance came on the night of the great winter ball, in the 5th year, when the whole house was turned upside down with the work of it, and every servant was wanted somewhere, and the green sitting room stood empty and unwatched for the first time in living memory. Coraline was below, reigning over the dancing in silver and emerald. The Duke was at the head of the hall, and the attic Duchess, sent up alone to fetch more candles from the store above, took instead a single quiet turning she was not meant to take, and let herself into the green sitting room and shut the door. The writing box was on the table by the window where a vain woman would keep it, walnut, brass-cornered, locked. Seraphina did not force it. She had not spent 5 years learning patience to ruin everything with a splintered lid and a tale of a broken lock. She knelt and looked at the lock in the moonlight, an ordinary lock, the twin of a dozen she had opened as a child in the years she did not speak of. And she took the long pin from her own plain hair, and she felt for the wards the way her mother had once, laughing, taught her to in another life, in a house by the sea. The lock gave with a small sound like a held breath let go. Inside, under a tray of sealing wax and pens, folded and yellowed, was the letter. She knew it at once. She had seen it for only a moment 5 years before, in a stranger's fist at the foot of a staircase, but a person does not forget the paper that ended their life. She lifted it out with steady fingers, and beneath it, where it had lain hidden all this time, was a second paper, the true letter, the original, the one Coraline had copied and twisted, still in the real hand, a real letter from a real relation, kept so the forger could match the loops and the slant, and folded with the two of them, because Coraline could not resist keeping the whole of her triumph in one place, was a third thing that stopped Seraphina's heart in her chest. A faded blue ribbon she would have known among 10,000, and tied in it a small gold seal ring she had last seen on her own mother's hand. Coraline Vane had not only forged the letter that exiled her, she had stolen, on some earlier night, the one keepsake Seraphina owned of the truth she had sworn never to speak. And in keeping it, the clever woman had kept, without ever understanding what she held, the proof of who the attic Duchess truly was. Because Seraphina was not the obscure orphan ward the household had stepped over for 5 years. The blue ribbon and the gold seal ring told the whole of it to anyone who could read a crest. She was the last living child of the House of Aldermere, the great estate that marched with Ravenmoor along the river, whose line had been thought ended in tragedy 20 years before. She had not ended. She had been carried away as an infant and hidden deliberately and at great cost, sworn to silence and raised quiet and nameless and safe, precisely so that the men who had destroyed her family could never find the heir while she was too small to defend herself. The marriage to Ravenmoor was to have been the thing that finally made her safe enough to come out of hiding and reclaim her name. Instead, on her wedding night, the secret she carried to be free had been the rope they hanged her with. The attic Duchess outranked every soul in that house. She had outranked them from the first cold step, and the one man who might have stood beside her had thrown her up the back stair himself. Serafina knelt on the floor of the green sitting room, with the 3 papers and the ribbon and the little gold ring in her 2 hands, and for the first time in 5 years she let herself shake, not from grief, from the enormous, terrible vertigo of a held breath finally reaching its end. Then she steadied. She put the writing box back exactly as she had found it, every pen and wax stick in its place, and she relocked it with the pin from her hair, because she was not yet ready for the house to know what she knew. She carried the forged letter, the true letter, the ribbon, and the ring up the back stair to the attic, and she knelt at the loose brick and drew out the diary, and she sprung the brass lock that had kept her truth for 5 years, and she laid the new proof in among the old, the boy's testimony and the steward's, and now the letters themselves, all of it together at last. She closed the diary. She held it against her chest in the dark exactly as she had held it on the bottom step of the staircase 5 years before, and she breathed. Now she had everything. The only question left was what to do with it. And Serafina, who had chosen patience over hatred on her first gray morning, found that she did not, in the end, want what a lesser woman would have wanted. She did not want Coraline Vane destroyed. She wanted the truth set down where it could not be twisted again, and she wanted her name back, and she wanted, though she was slow to admit it even to the diary, to look the Duke of Ravenmore in the eye once more as the woman she truly was, and let him understand exactly what he had cast up the servant's stair, and then walk out of his house on her own 2 feet, owing him nothing. That was all. It was a colder ambition than revenge, and a far more dangerous one, because revenge ends and the truth does not. But the house, having done her one wrong, was about to do her a second, and it would force her hand before she was ready. For something had begun to shift in the great rooms that winter, and Coraline Vane had felt it before anyone, the way a spider feels a single wrong tremor in the web. The Duke had grown restless. Twice in the last month he had asked old Hartwell odd, quiet questions about the night of the wedding. Small questions, careful ones, a man's fingers worrying at a knot he could not quite see. He had begun, on the nights of the balls, to let his gray eyes follow the gray woman with the tray a moment longer than a man looks at a servant. And once, walking the long candle-lit corridor past the closed door of the servant's wing, he had stopped and laid his hand flat against the cold stone wall, and stood there a long while with his head turned toward that shut door as though he had heard, faint and far off, a voice he had spent 5 years teaching himself to forget. He did not go in, but he stood there, and Coraline, who missed nothing where her own power was concerned, understood that the fortress of his certainty had developed a crack, and that a crack, left alone, would widen, so she moved to end it before it could. A dissolved marriage, a banished woman sent away for good to some distant cottage where no restless duke could stumble over her in his own halls at midnight. That was the safe thing, the final thing, and Coraline had spent 5 years learning that the only secrets that stay buried are the ones you bury twice. She would have the attic Duchess gone past all recalling, and she would have it done publicly, with the Duke's own hand to the papers, so that he could never afterward pretend the cruelty had not been his. She had not reckoned on one thing only, the one thing the clever never reckon on, that the woman she meant to bury twice had spent those same 5 years quietly assembling, behind a loose brick under a brass lock, the proof that would bury her instead. It was Coraline Vane who forced it, in the end, because clever people grow careless when they have won for too long. 3 nights after the winter ball, the household was called together in the great hall. Not the servants this time, but the family and the few grand guests still wintering at Ravenmore, with the lowest staff kept back along the walls to wait upon them. Serafina was among the waiting, gray at the cold edge of the candlelight with a wine jug in her hands, when Coraline rose from the late Duchess's chair in a gown of emerald and silver and made her announcement in a voice pitched to carry to every corner. She had, she said, persuaded his grace to set right at last the great error of his marriage. The woman in the attic had clung 5 years to a union she could never honor, refusing even now to confess who she truly was. It was time, surely, that the Duke was freed of so barren and shameful a bond. Lawyers had been consulted. The marriage was to be dissolved, and once the Duke was free, Here she let her dark eyes rest, just for an instant, on the carved man at the head of the room. Once he was free, perhaps the house might at last have the mistress it had so long deserved. It was beautifully done. It was a knife wrapped in concern. And it was meant, Serafina understood, to provoke the attic Duchess at last into some public outburst, some shrieking, undignified scene that would prove to the whole room that the Duke had been right to cage her. For a woman who breaks is a woman who can be dismissed, and Coraline had been waiting 5 years for her to break. Serafina set down the wine jug. She did it quietly on a side table with both hands, and the small, deliberate sound of it turned every head in the hall. Then she walked out into the center of the candlelight, gray and plain among all that silk, and she did not shriek and she did not weep. She reached up and drew out from beneath her collar into the light the thin gold chain she had worn against her skin for 5 years, and she let it lie openly at the throat of her servant's dress. And the room went very still, because there was something in the way the cast-off woman stood that did not belong to a housemaid at all. "Before the marriage is dissolved," she said, and her voice was low and clear and carried without rising, the way the Duke's had carried 5 years before, "the house should perhaps know who it is dissolving it from. She is hysterical." Coraline said quickly, too quickly, "Someone remove her." "No one will touch me," Serafina said, and no one did, and that itself was a marvel. A gray housemaid stopping a hall full of gentlefolk with 8 quiet words. And the Duke, at the head of the room, had risen half out of his chair with a look on his stone face that no one there had ever seen, as though the floor of his certainty had moved under him for the first time in 5 years. "I will go up," Serafina said to the room, "and I will bring down the truth, written and sealed, and you may all read it for yourselves and judge. I have kept it 5 years. I am tired of keeping it." She turned her green eyes for one long moment on Coraline Vane, who had gone the color of her own pearls. And then, "Your Grace," she said to Alaric without looking at him, "you will have your wish. I will be gone from your house by morning, but you will know first exactly what it is you are sending away." She went up the back stair one last time, the way she had gone up it the first night, except that this time the whole hall waited below in silence for her to come down, and that difference was 5 years wide. What she did not know, what little Tom told her only long after, was what happened in the hall while she was gone. The Duke did not sit back down. He stood in the terrible silence, and then he turned, slowly, to Coraline Vane, and he asked her one quiet question. He asked her how she had come by the letter she had given him 5 years before. And Coraline, who had answered that question 100 times without a flicker, answered it the 101st time with a flicker. A half-second hesitation, a glance toward the door through which the gray woman had vanished. And the Duke of Ravenmore, who had spent 5 years being lied to and had built a fortress of certainty on the lie, felt the first stone of it come loose. He did not wait for Serafina to come down. He could not. He crossed to old Hartwell, who stood pale against the wall, and he said, "Lo, if you have ever had a thing to tell me, tell it now." And the old steward, who had carried his wickedness 4 years and could carry it no further, told him. The locked cabinet, the second key, the letter that could not have been where Lady Vane had sworn she found it. He told it in a shaking voice in front of them all, and with every word the Duke's olive face went grayer, and Coraline's grew harder and more brilliant and more afraid. So that when Serafina came back down the grand staircase, not the servants' stair, the great front stair, descending into the candlelight with the open diary in her 2 hands and 5 years in her level eyes, she came down into a hall that was already breaking open, into a husband who was already, at last, beginning to understand. She did not falter on the stairs. She had imagined this descent 1,000 times in the attic dark, and in the imagining she had always been afraid, and now that it was real she found she was not afraid at all, only very calm, the calm of a held breath at its very end. The household watched her come, and one by one, not knowing why, the old servants along the walls began to bow. Bess first, her chapped hand pressed to her mouth, and then the others, a slow falling motion down the length of the hall, as though the gray woman on the stairs were trailing something invisible and enormous behind her. She reached the foot of the staircase, the exact step where the footman had once set her diary down like refuse, and she stopped, and she opened the book. She read them the forged letter first, in Coraline's careful copied hand. Then she read them the true letter beside it, in the real hand, and she held the 2 papers up together in the candlelight so that any fool could see the same loops drawn twice, once honest and once stolen. She laid little Tom's testimony before them, the writing box and the burning candle the night before the wedding. She laid Hartwell's beside it, though he had already given it with his own trembling mouth. And then, last, she untied from the pages a faded blue ribbon, and let fall into her open palm a small gold seal ring, and she held it up and she told them, at last, after 20 years of sworn silence, who she was. She was Seraphina of Aldermere, the lost heir of the river house, the child who had not died. The name went through the hall like a wind through standing corn. There were old people in that room who had known the Aldermere tragedy, who had believed the whole line ended, and they looked at the crest on the little gold ring and at the green eyes of the woman who held it, and they made a sound, a low collective intake of breath. That was the sound of a buried truth coming up into the air. Lady Margaret Fenwick, who had coined the name Attic Duchess and snapped her fan over it for 5 years, sat down very suddenly in a chair that a footman had to push beneath her, and did not say one word, and would never again, to the end of her days, find that particular joke amusing. And Coraline Vane, seeing it all come down, did the only thing left to a cornered, clever woman. She lied, brilliantly, to the last. She had done it for the family, she cried. She had been deceived herself. The ring was a forgery, the whole performance a desperate, grasping fraud. But her voice climbed as she said it, higher and higher, and the higher it climbed the more. The silent gray dignity of the woman at the foot of the stairs gave the lie to every word, because the room could see now plainly which of the two women was breaking and which was not. Coraline broke. Seraphina did not. 5 years of patience had built the one and burned through the other, and everyone in that candlelit hall could see it with their own eyes, and no one needed to be told. The Duke had not moved through any of it. He stood 3 steps up the staircase, the same 3 steps he had come down 5 years before to condemn her, and he looked at his wife reading the proof of his own blindness in a housemaid's gray wool, and the carved stillness of his face did not so much crack as dissolve, slowly like a frost going off stone in the sun. When Seraphina finished, when she closed the diary and lowered it, and finally, for the first time in 5 years, looked directly up the staircase into his storm-gray eyes, the Duke of Ravenmore came down the 3 steps and stopped in front of her, and for a long moment the man who never showed anything to anyone could not speak at all. "What I did to you," he said at last, and his low voice was not steady now, not steady in the least. "There is no word for. I will not insult you by reaching for one." "No." Seraphina agreed quietly. "There is not. The letter, I should have known. The hand was too perfect. A frightened relation does not write a perfect hand. I wanted—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I had been deceived once before in the city by someone I trusted, and I came home swearing I would never be made a fool of again. And he did not look at Coraline. He never looked at her again. She had only to set the bait where my fear would find it. I was so afraid of being made a fool that I made myself the worst kind there is. I looked at the one true thing in this house and I called it a lie, and I sent it up the back stair. 5 years. His gray eyes moved over the gray dress, the chapped hands, the gold chain she had worn hidden against her skin all that time, and something in him seemed to fold under the weight of it. 5 years you mended my coats. I held them in my own hands and never once looked to see whose stitches kept me whole. They were mine, she said, everyone. I know it now. She let the silence sit. She had earned the silence. Then she said, without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty, "I told you I would be gone by morning, and I will. I did not bring this down to win you back, Alaric. I brought it down because I am done being a secret, and I am done being a servant, and I am owed my name, and now I have it. Tomorrow I go to Aldermere, to the house that is mine, and I take up the life that was stolen from me before I could walk." She closed her hand around the little gold ring. "I forgive you. I find that I do tonight, which surprises me. But forgiveness is not the same as staying, and I am not going to stay." And she meant it. That was the thing the whole hall understood, watching them, that the Attic Duchess was not bargaining, was not playing for a grander apology, was simply, quietly, leaving. She had outranked them all along, and now she was going home, and the going was real. She left the great hall that night, and she did not sleep in the attic. Bess would not allow it. The old lady's maid took her instead to the late Duchess's own chambers, the room Seraphina had been forbidden on her wedding night, and turned down the fine bed with her chapped hands and wept the whole time and would not be stopped. And Seraphina let her and slept her last night under that roof in the bed that should always have been hers. In the morning, before the bells, for the second time in 5 years, she changed her dress, but this time she put off the gray, and Bess brought up from somewhere a deep crimson velvet traveling cloak, fine and warm, and a simple gray gown beneath it, and the thin gold chain went outside the collar now, in the light where it would stay. The household had not slept either. The whole of Ravenmoor was awake and out in the cold rainlight of that early morning, gathered in the great hall and spilling out the doors, because word travels through a house faster than fire, and every soul under that roof wanted to see the attic Duchess go. She came down the grand staircase a second time, in crimson and gold once more after 5 gray years, with the locked diary in one gloved hand, and the household bowed to her the whole length of the hall, and this time they knew exactly why. Old Hartwell stood at the door with his spectacles fogged, and he bowed so low his brass chain of office swung free, and he said, "Aldermere is a fortunate house, your grace, and Ravenmoor a poorer one this morning than it has ever been." Little Tom was there, barefoot still, his smudged face wet, and Seraphina knelt down in her traveling cloak on the cold marble in front of all of them, and took the boy by his thin shoulders. "You gave me the first thread," she told him quietly. "I would still be a secret in an attic if a kitchen boy had not been brave enough to remember a candle. You will not stay a kitchen boy, Tom. You will come to Aldermere when you are ready, and there will be a place for you there, a real one, with your name on it. Do you understand me?" The boy could not speak. He nodded hard, the way he always nodded, and Seraphina kissed his smudged forehead and stood. Tempest was harnessed to the traveling carriage in the rain outside. The great black stallion, that had thrown 3 grooms and reared at every hand in the stable yard for 5 years, and gone calm only ever for her, the gray woman who came out some nights to lay a steady palm on his muzzle when no one else could hold him. He stood quiet now in the traces, breath steaming, while she crossed the wet cobbles as though he knew. Animals always seemed to know these things around her, that she was leaving, and that he was the one who got to carry her. She paused on the rain-wet steps and turned back once, to the lit doorway and the silent crowd in it, and to the man standing apart at the foot of the great stairs with his hand half lifted toward her and his carved composure gone at last to open dread. "Goodbye, Alaric," she said, and she got into the carriage and Bess climbed up beside her, and old Hartwell himself took the bridle and led Tempest out, and the carriage rolled away into the gray rain down the long drive of Ravenmoor, and, behind her, every window of the great house was lit, the whole vast dark facade of it blazing yellow in the rain, as though the estate itself had woken and could not bear to watch her go. The Duke followed her. He did not order a horse. There was no time, and besides, some part of him seemed to understand that this was not a thing a man does on horseback. He went out into the cold rain in his black velvet and his ruined cravat, bareheaded, and he followed the carriage on foot down the drive and out the great gates and onto the country road beyond, walking and then running, the rain soaking him through, the mud taking his polished boots, the heavy gold signet ring loose on his wet finger. He followed her past the boundary stone where Ravenmoor ended. He followed her along the dark hedgerows with the carriage lamps swinging ahead of him, in the wet. He followed her until the gray-gold dawn began to break low over the fields, and the carriage was only a small shape far ahead on the long road to Aldermere, and then he stopped because he could not catch it, because he was never going to catch it, because some things, once they are sent up the back stair, do not come down again for the asking. He stood alone on the rain-washed road at first light, soaked to the skin, and watched the place where she had gone. And the great house of Ravenmoor stood small and bright behind him with every window burning, and the Duke of Ravenmoor, who had married her at dawn and exiled her by midnight, learned at last and far too late the whole weight of what he had thrown away. Inside the carriage Seraphina did not look back. She held the diary in her lap and she watched the gray gold light come up over the fields that had been her family's once and would be hers again by nightfall, and she breathed, slow and even, the way she had taught herself to breathe in 5 years of the cold wing, and for the first time since she was a child, she was not a secret anyone had to keep. She came home to Aldermere as the sun was going down. The house by the river was smaller than Ravenmoor and far gentler, and the old people who had served her family a generation before were waiting on the steps, having heard, weeping openly, bowing to the green-eyed woman they had last seen as an infant carried away in the dark. She walked up the steps of her own house in the low gold light of that long day's sundown, 23 when she was sent up the servant stair and 28 now, 5 years older and immeasurably harder to break, and she went through the rooms that had waited for her, touching the cold walls, and at last she came to a small sitting room that looked west over the river, and she set the diary down open on the windowsill. She undid the brass lock for the last time. She did not need it now. There was nothing left in the book that had to be kept secret, because the secret was out and standing in the light wearing her own face, and a diary kept against the dark has no work left to do once the dark is over. She left it open to the page that held the faded blue ribbon, her mother's ribbon, and she laid the thin gold chain beside it on the sill, and she lit a single candle against the coming dusk, and through the window the last gold of the sun went down over the water, and the first stars came out one at a time over the house of Aldermere. She was not alone, and she would not be alone again. Bess was below stairs already, scolding the old cook and weeping and laughing by turns, mistress of the household at last. Word would reach the city within the week, and old Hartwell would come to Aldermere by the month's end, unable to stay at a house he had loved once the rightful woman had left it, to keep her accounts and her conscience as he had kept Ravenmore's. And little Tom would come too, in his own time, barefoot no longer, to a place with his name on it, the kitchen boy who had remembered a candle and so brought down a wickedness 5 years in the building. They were her family now, the ones who had seen the truth of her before the world would, and she counted them over in the firelight, the way she had once counted her cruelties, in the dark, except that now the counting was a comfort. She thought of the man on the road behind her only once that night, and without bitterness. She did not know yet whether he would come, whether in a season or a year, a soaked and humbled duke might appear at the gates of Aldermere, with no letter in his fist and nothing to offer but the truth, and ask, not for a duchess, but only for the chance to begin again as the man he should have been. She did not know, and she found she could wait to find out. She had become, in 5 years of the cold wing, a woman who could wait for anything. If he came, he would find her changed, and her name her own, and her door. She decided this, watching the last star come out. Her door not barred against him, but not flung open either. He would have to climb to her this time. It seemed only fair, after the stairs he had made her climb. Some men keep love by locking it in the attic and calling it a lie. Others have to chase it down a dark road in the rain to learn it was the only true thing in the house. So here is the question Seraphina would leave you with if she set down her diary and looked up at you across the candlelight. When the whole bright room has decided that someone is worth nothing and sends them up the back stair, would you have broken and begged and let them make you small, or would you have done what she did and kept your name folded quiet behind a loose brick and waited, however many cold years it took, for the night you could come back down the front stairs and walk out the door as yourself?